Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar, Exploring the Traps and Treasures of Unconscious Bias. This is one in a series of webinars where we connect for 30 minutes to bring to life the challenges we see in the market and what to do about them. During today's session, Leanne Loesch, Axion's Client Solutions Lead, will engage us in a dialogue about how unconscious bias often drives our conclusions, decisions, and behaviors without us even being aware of them. We will host a Q&A session at the end, and if you have any questions that might pop up during the presentation, you can use your control panel and tap in the question, and we will answer them later in the call. So with that, I pass it on to you, Leanne.
Thanks, Barbie, and good afternoon and good evening, everyone. So as I was talking to Barbie at the beginning while we were waiting for everybody to join, she asked me what I liked about unconscious bias. And I had a laugh and thought, oh, I like it because it really connects me to my humanity, to my humanness. And the reason why I thought that was because I was coming home from seeing a client today, and I was in an Uber, and I jumped in the Uber and we were driving along. And then we came to a traffic jam, and my Uber driver said, oh, there's a traffic jam. And I immediately panicked because I looked at my Uber driver and realized he was about 70. And then I went, oh my God, he's not going to know how to use his GPS. I'm going to be caught in this traffic jam forever. He's not going to be able to get us out of there. And then I laughed at myself and I thought, God, that's a great example of unconscious bias. That I automatically assumed that because he was old, he wouldn't be able to use his GPS or his navigational tool for those people that live in different countries. So that's what I like about unconscious bias. It happens without even knowing about it, and everybody has it. So who am I? I am Leanne Loesch. This is my photo. I was born and raised in New Zealand. I've lived and worked in Asia, the UK, Europe, and now I live and work in the US. So immediately that I tell you that, you'll have some sort of unconscious bias about me, some sort of preference, some sort of something in my description will have triggered something in you to make a judgment or a decision about me. And in my lifetime, having lived and worked in Asia, UK, Europe, and now the US, I have myself experienced lots of unconscious bias towards me and from me towards other people. So what I love about unconscious bias is just that it can be a gateway, a doorway into understanding ourselves and understanding each other better. And so what I'm going to talk to you about is what is it? What is unconscious bias? What is its impact? And how can we mitigate the risks and use it for our advantage, use it as something that connects us in our humanity with each other. So what is it? Well, to be biased is to be human. And the unconscious bias is our hidden preference for or against a person, thing, or group that influences our judgment and distorts our decisions. And it's normal. It's normal, it's functional, it's adaptive, it's a cognitive process. And I'm going to talk about this a bit later in the webinar. And it leads to both favorable and unfavorable assessments. Oftentimes we usually associate it with unfavorable assessments, but I was a Kiwi living in the United Kingdom where Kiwis are favored in the United Kingdom. We have a positive stereotype that we're hardworking. So I was the benefit of a positive, favorable unconscious bias. We need biases to survive. We cannot possibly navigate the world without biases. It's hardwired into our system. We receive 11 million pieces of information in a moment, and our brain can only process about 40. So we have this automatic processing system in our brains to help us walk out the door. If you imagine if all the decisions that you would have to make just to walk out the door that your brain automatically does, if we had to make a decision to do all of that, okay, I've got to pick my foot up, put it down, pick my other foot up, put it down, walk out the door, my God, it would take forever. So And every one of us is biased. Every one of us has a hidden preference for or against a person, thing, or group. And the roots of this lie in our culture, our upbringing, our education, the media. Even though I have lived more time out of New Zealand than in New Zealand, I automatically look at the world through my New Zealand lens. And when I see people, I have a friend in America who's a New Zealander, we just automatically laugh about the same things. We just sink into each other as soon as we meet up. So there's a way that I look that comes from being a New Zealander. And this, for me, is the most important thing of this sort of webinar, that we can consciously believe in inequality and an inclusive approach while simultaneously acting on unconscious prejudice. And I say this is really important because it's how we work with our unconscious bias that is so important, because it can be shaming. The other day I was talking to a colleague and he said, oh, I'll send that to my assistant. And I went, oh, okay, can you ask her to do X, Y, and Z? And he went, Leanne, you just assumed that was a woman. You're sexist. And I cowered in the corner, horrified that I could assume, I could make that assumption, I could do that. And also the way that he addressed it with me didn't help, because I felt really shamed and embarrassed and humiliated, whereas he could have said, hey, did you notice that you said she? And I could have laughed about it. So there's something about we do it automatically, but how do we hold that? That's really important. So what is it? Let's move on. We're going to talk about what it is, what the impact it is, and how we work with it. So the first slide I want to show you is, I'd ask you to close your left eye and look at the R on the screen. For those people who are dialing in, you won't be able to see this, but maybe you can look at the webinar later. So you're closing your left eye, you're looking at the R on the screen, and I want you to move closer towards the screen. And at some stage, as you move closer towards the screen, the L will disappear from your view. This is your physical blind spot. What's interesting about that is when the L disappears from your view, there's not a hole that appears. Your brain automatically fills in where that L has disappeared from with the maze on the screen. So your brain just fills it in. You have a blind spot and your brain fills it in. And this physical blind spot can happen in social and cognitive blind spots as well. That we have a blind spot and our brain automatically fills it in and this what adds to our hidden prejudices and distortions and preferences, is that our brain just fills in the information when we have a blind spot in these areas. And I'm going to talk to you about how we know that. We know that because before 1980, 95% of musicians in orchestras were men. And once they instituted blind auditions, that figure dropped to 75%. So we were blind. We had an automatic assumption that male musicians were better than female musicians, even though cognitively we probably didn't think that, we weren't even aware of it, we were doing it unconsciously in our behavior. And it's only through blind auditions that we were able to see that. Another study that talks about the 5,000 resumes were sent to 1,250 employers, 50 with white-sounding names and 50 with black-sounding names. And the white-sounding names got 50% more callbacks. Now, I'm sure if you asked all those employers, they wouldn't say that they were choosing white-sounding names over black-sounding names, yet they did that. And you can go on to, if you type in implicit bias test, there's lots and lots of tests that will show you how you, even though you believe one thing, you actually are unconsciously choosing another thing. And these implicit bias tests will show you where your blind spots are. There's a very famous story by Nelson Mandela, who, when he was traveling the world doing anti-racism talks and anti-apartheid talks, he got on a plane in Ethiopia and he saw the plane driver, I was going to call the plane driver, the flyer of the plane, the pilot, that's the one. He saw the pilot walk onto the plane, and the pilot was black, and he noticed that he panicked, and he thought, black men can't fly planes. It was an automatic hidden bias that he had around who is a pilot and who isn't. So these things happen so automatically, and we internalize them, which is what Nelson Mandela had done. We've got studies about how we internalize societal bias. And this is a study that shows that girls who identified their gender on a math test underperformed more than when they didn't identify their gender on a math test. So when they had to say, I'm a female, they did more poorly than when they just sat down and did the test. And the same has also been tested for males around literature. We commonly think of bias as race, class, sex, age, and we don't think about all the cognitive biases that we have. Here's an example of 8, but there are over 200 biases, and we will send you links in the article that I write around all these biases so that you can come and have a look at them. And these cognitive biases are more powerful because they're not visible. We don't see them. My favorite one of these is the blind spot bias, which is failing to recognize your own cognitive bias as a bias itself. People notice cognitive and motivational biases much more in others than themselves. And that's probably happened to you. We can see it in other people, yet we can't see it in ourselves. So why do we do this? Why do we have this? How does it come about? And Bernardi and Greenwald are prolific writers and researchers in this area. They've written a book called The Blind Spot, and I'll put that reference in the article that I send you. And they talk about these mind bugs, and that these mind bugs are ingrained habits of thought that lead to errors in how we perceive, reason, remember, and make decisions. It's like this mind bug fills in the space in our blind spots. And we know this when we think about eyewitness accounts and how there's hundreds of tests that show that eyewitness testimonies aren't I can't even think of the word, they aren't verifying. And the one that I like is when you go to a meeting with your colleague and you come out of the meeting and you go, wow, I thought that was a really good point that Jim made. And your colleague goes, what? Jim made a good point? Oh, I don't remember Jim saying that. But what about when Betty said that? Or when two people can go to exactly the same meeting, yet you come out with different understandings of what was the main point or what happened in the meeting. And it's very similar to this whole idea of eyewitness accounts and these mind bugs. We just fill in the blanks. We look for what makes sense for us, and if there's a gap in our sense making, then these mind bugs fill it in, and it's all happening without our awareness. So let's show you how it actually works in your mind. So if you look at the screen, what do you notice? So some of you will be looking, thinking the dots are going from white to black, white to black, white to black. Yet how can that physically be possible? Because this is a computer screen that you're looking at. It's not alive, it's not electronic, it's not, well, it is electronic, but it's not flashing backwards and forwards. It's a photo. How is it possible? So our mind is playing tricks on us. It's tricking us to think that we can see black and white dots. So some of you might be feeling a bit, oh goodness, I can't believe anything that my mind thinks. And to a certain extent, you're right. It is about our mind can't cope with the information, so it's constantly making stuff up. And so believing what we're thinking and not questioning it is when we fall in the holes of that unconscious bias can lead to it being a trap and it being destructive for us. So here's some more examples. I want you to you don't have to say it out loud, or you can if you want because you're on mute and I won't hear you. So what continent is Kenya in? What are two opposing colors in the game of chess? Some of you might know this. Name any animal. For those of you that don't know this, did any of you think of a zebra, or as they say in the United States, a zebra? Did anybody think of a zebra or zebra? Or did anybody think of an animal in Africa? So when they've done this test, 20% of people think of a zebra and 50% of people think of an animal in Africa. Whereas if I was just to ask you to think of a random animal, only 1% of you would think of a zebra. So this is what's known as the priming effect. And some of you may know this already because the advertising industry is totally built on our ability to take our minds down a route to make us think of a thing and make us want a thing. So this is another example of how we think we're rational, but we're actually very irrational, and our thinking happens without us. And so let's explore it a tiny bit more with this next exercise. So I'm going to tell you a little story. An individual has been described by a neighbor as follows. Taylor is very shy and withdrawn, invariably helpful, but with very little interest in people or in the world of reality. Taylor is a meek and tidy soul who has a need for order and structure and a passion for detail. Is Taylor more likely to be a librarian or a farmer? So we'd love you to select one of the following. Taylor is more likely to be a librarian or a farmer. Okay, so we see here that 75% of you chose librarian and 25% of you chose a farmer. So what's interesting is, why is it that you chose a librarian or a farmer? So I would posit a guess. It's because when I described this, what came to mind in your mind was a librarian. Or what came to mind was a farmer, that the attributes, the adjectives, all the words that I was using conjured up in your head either a librarian or a farmer, depending on what those words mean for you. However, did any one of you think, there are 5 times more farmers than librarians in America, or if you're calling in from Australia, that percentage is higher, to 8%. Did any of you think, so therefore, statistically, there's more chances of Taylor being a farmer than a librarian? Chances are none of you actually thought that. So we don't make decisions based on statistics or facts. We tend to make decisions based on what happens in our brain, our visual, our associative memory, how our brain works to bring that piece of information together. Let's try another one. Did you, when I was talking about this, did you think that Taylor was a man or a woman, or a male or a female here? We're going to do another poll. Was Taylor a male or a female? There is no right or wrong here. Just whatever comes to mind. And once you've answered whether Taylor was a male or female, try and work out why you chose that. Why did you think that Taylor was a male or a female? So we had 50% male and 50% female. Excellent. Excellent. So I'm more curious about why you chose a male or a female. Was it because if you thought that Taylor was a librarian, you associate women with librarians? If you thought that Taylor was a male, do you associate male with female? Was it because you thought, Leanne's trying to get a sneaky one here and I'm going to outguess her by choosing the thing that I didn't think? So I think it's a male, but I'm going to choose a female. What was the brain process that went on inside you? Or did you think it could be either a male or a female? Because Taylor, there's just that we got a, or did you think it's a female? Because I remember Taylor and Taylor Swift, or I've got a friend called Taylor who's a male. Did you associate it that way? There are so many different ways we associate, as opposed to thinking, well, actually, the chances are 50-50 that it's a male or a female. So our brain does this automatically, as you've seen. Now let's apply it to the workplace, because this is where we see unconscious bias even more so, because unconscious bias loves conditions of urgency, speed, too much information, having to act fast, having to make meaning without all the information. So that's the sort of environments that we work in, and therefore in those speed, highly driven, highly efficient, highly stressful situations, we default very quickly to our bias. Here's an example of a confirmation bias. Yes, he said he would give me a raise. Well, not in those words, but I can tell from his actions. He congratulated me and said we would discuss my future. It's in the bag. How many times at work we look for confirmation because we're unsure of ourselves or a decision or what's happening, because our workplaces are so uncertain, even more uncertain and more complex than they've ever been before. So we rely on our biases. They happen unconsciously. And we want to feel that we've made the right decision. So confirmation bias is when we see things and that we make a decision and then we want support for it. How many projects have you seen in your organizations that go into meetings and everybody just talks about what's good about it, that we're looking for that project to do well because we want a win for our company? Or you choose somebody, you recruit somebody onto your team, and you look for confirmation that you made the best decision in recruiting them. So you're always looking for things that they're doing well. And that's not to say that we look for things that they do badly to balance it. It's just to notice that we're caught in a confirmation bias. These are some other ones that we do. For example, the pro-innovation bias. You know, we work with a lot of tech organizations, and there's this that they tend to especially if we're working with engineers who are looking for the latest gadget, the latest thing to be exciting and going to be sold, and so we overvalue its usefulness. Oh, I've got this great idea or this innovative process or thing that's going to change the world, especially I live in San Francisco, so tech startup central. Everybody's got the new best thing. And then you know, we can see that in the overconfidence bias, that we're confident about our abilities. I'm going to be the next, you know, I'm going to make my millions in the startup, in a startup. And we see, you know, I see outcome bias when I work with sales companies, that, you know, it doesn't matter how we get there, but the most important thing is that we got a good outcome. They're not actually looking at how the decision was made. It's just judging a decision on the outcome. And then we work with insurance companies, and there's zero risk bias. Sociologists have found that we love certainty, even if it's counterproductive, that we're, especially in these uncertain times, that we're looking to find certainty. And because our brain loves certainty, it loves the known, it doesn't like the agitation of being in the unknown. And again, I know I flicked through these biases, and we'll send them to you so you can look at them at your leisure. And these are only 20 that we got out. There are loads more than this in the world. So thinking about these unconscious biases, is this like, are we just a faulty programming, or is this evolutionary successes? And as I said before, we are programmed to work with, we are programmed to automatically select and filter information, and automatically remember. Like if we had to learn how to drive a car every time we got in it, It would be crazy making. So the way our unconscious biases and our preferences and our automatic processes are very valuable for our survival. They make complex tasks simple. They make us quicker and more efficient. They help us to make meaning of the world. They help us to cope with the flood of information that we're receiving. They help us to remember things by grouping things into categories and assigning people to different categories. They help us to function. However, and you know, the most classic one is back when we were living in more of a tribal existence. We needed to have stranger danger. We needed to say, okay, you're one of us. You're part of my tribe. They're different. They're foreign. They're not familiar. That I need to be scared of them. I need to be aware of them and alert and pay attention and protect my tribe from them. And that made sense because they were, especially in the days of cannibalism, you'd be eaten if you were friendly. If you walked up to somebody with a bit of diversity and said, hey, tell me, you're different to me, let's chat, they would eat you. Whereas nowadays, that doesn't happen. So, because we live in a different time, if we don't pay attention to the diversity, if we're not including people who are different to us, then the financial cost and the business cost is huge. We don't innovate, we don't take risks, we don't collaborate, we stay in our silos, we don't make good problems, we don't solve problems well. We have a huge impact on the way that businesses are run. People don't feel safe, they don't feel it's an inclusive environment. So that's where, the business outcomes are huge. And some of the studies that are being done nowadays, we can talk about the impact on business outcomes. And this study that was done in 2012 on diversity and inclusion showed that if the employees think that the organization is committed to and supportive of diversity and inclusion, then those businesses report better business outcomes. The ability to innovate is increased by 83%. I mean, that's huge. And you can think of it yourself, really. When you're in an organization that encourages diversity and everybody feels included, of course you feel more innovative because you're not trying to protect yourself or not trying to get in the in crowd or not trying to say the right thing so that you stay included. But if everything is acceptable and everybody's included, then you can think more freely. You can be more responsive to customer needs. You can collaborate well. And there are there's lots of other studies around gender, race, age. This particular study shows that if we have equal women and men in boards, then these companies, on the boards of these companies, 53% return on equity, 42% more, this is more than a normal company, return on sales, 66% return on invested capital. I mean, these figures are staggering for if we have diverse and inclusive cultures. So Axulent is an organization that works around cultural transformation. That's why we are so interested in unconscious bias, and our clients are so interested in unconscious bias, and we do a lot of work around unconscious bias because of these staggering business outcomes, that just by people working to overcome the destructive effects of bias can lead to more diverse, more inclusive cultures, has a staggering result. I'm repeating myself, but I'm coming to my point, which is we work with lots of companies around this, and due to time, I just want to share 4 strategies with you that we've worked with people to help them to do. So I'm just going to, my computer is becoming aware, knowing who you are, opening the dialogue, and finding your community. these are just 4 strategies that I'm going to whiz through in the next 10 minutes and talk to you about what you can do. So, how aware are you? This is becoming aware. How aware are you? Really getting to understand how, because we don't see things the way they are. We tend to see things the way we want them to be. And this is a result of culture, upbringing, education, and the media. So how can you challenge your own thinking? What do you need to do to actually think more around, sorry, I've just looked at the time and realized it's 5:31, so my mind has temporarily gone to, oh, it's taken me half an hour. So I've started to speed up. So I'm just going to slow down. So I'm sure that I had an unconscious bias of I've taken up too much time. So I'm going to slow down and this is one of the most important things for me is how can you challenge your own thinking. So just me challenging my own thinking then was real. I realized that I had an unconscious bias. I was judging myself that I was taking too long. And so I noticed I started to speed up, that my head started to spin a tiny bit, and then I started to panic, and I started to get my mind started to race. So challenging your own thinking is really just becoming aware of yourself every moment. Like what happened then? I got tense, my brain started to spin, I started to get quick in my thinking. So how do you do that? How do you challenge your own thinking? And there's a lot of information written about ways to do that, you know, journaling, having thinking partners, doing inquiry, having a sort of inquiry way of working in your teams and challenging your colleagues and getting them to challenge you. Excellent has this way of asking people, what do you think? These are my thoughts. What about your thoughts? So constantly creating an atmosphere where it's okay to unzip and tell people what you're thinking. The second one is, what impact do you want to have in your organization? Asking this is very powerful and very important, because what is it that you want to do? What do you want to be known for? How do you want to tackle unconscious bias? What's the, you know, what are you capable of doing? What's the result that you want? And how are you going to do that? So you're preparing and planning and thinking about the impact that you want. And this will help you to determine the decisions you make and the actions you take. Opening the dialogue. This is a really important one. Once you've examined your own thinking and you've decided the impact that you want to have in the organization, it's how do you open the dialogue? And one of the things that often gets in the way is that we assume that we say what we mean and that the other person hears what we say and knows what we mean. But actually, unconscious bias totally obliterates that, because not very often do we say what we mean, because we have an unconscious bias that it's not okay to say what we mean. And the other people don't usually hear what we say because they're too busy with their own unconscious bias and filtering what we say. So we have a tool that we work with that some of you may have already seen, called the ladder of inference. And this is one of the tools that we work with. This is a very powerful tool in terms of it helps us to get down to what are the facts. Because so often we don't talk about facts. We talk about actions and recommendations, or decisions and conclusions. But actually, there is a fact, and then there's an interpretation. We make an interpretation about it, and there are inferences that impact our interpretation. We make assumptions, and then we drive opinions from our interpretations and our assumptions, and these opinions are impacted by our values and standards. And then from our opinions, we make decisions, and we draw conclusions, and then those decisions and conclusions lead to actions and recommendations. How many times Have you seen in organizations where people move quickly away from the facts up into actions and recommendations? And I'm going to show you an example. So here's the fact. Susan speaks once during a meeting. Now, a person that has an unconscious bias that says strong leaders should showcase their viewpoints is going to make the following inferences about Susan. She lets her team members take over the meeting. She should speak up and provide guidance to her team. She understands the issues well, but is not assertive enough. She cannot lead a team. She has poor leadership skills. Therefore, the next time there is a bigger project, we think that Susan needs to work on her assertiveness before she can move forward in her career. This is totally different to the opposite side. I'm going to have to take that out for a minute. Oops, it got in the way and I couldn't move it. So I'm coming back to my slideshow. Here we are. Yes, now I can see it. Susan speaks once during a meeting. Oops. We've got that one now. Strong leaders don't need to overstate their expertise. That's the hidden bias that Susan speaks once during a meeting evokes in this person. Therefore, this hidden bias influences their decision and inferences and opinions by Susan lets her team members showcase their work. Susan made a very insightful comment. Susan understands the issues well and knows how to listen. Susan is a strong project lead and has leadership potential. The next time there is a bigger project, we think of Susan for the leadership role. Now, all of those different opposite conclusions came from that one fact. So in order to work with the ladder of inference, we need curiosity. We need to know that our rationality is limited, that we don't see the facts, that what we actually work in is a world full of opinions and interpretations and inferences and assumptions, and that other people, their perspectives are complementary and they can help us to get to the facts and they can help us to make decisions based on the facts and they can help us to see our hidden biases and we can help them. And in order to have curiosity, we need to have a growth mindset. We need to value being effective and learn, as opposed to a fixed mindset, whereas the fixed mindset values being right. One of my colleagues sent an email to one of our clients, and he was talking about unconscious bias, and he did a typo, and the spell corrected it. The spell check corrected it to uncurious bias, which I thought was hilarious because it really is that, our unconscious bias, our uncurious bias. We see the world and we believe it is one way. We don't challenge it, or we don't think of it in a different way. So coming to the end now, and I want to leave you with this idea of a spiritual harness, which is at the end of the day, no matter what is important to you? You know, we always have to return to ourselves and staying aligned to our values. And even though we can see ourselves operating with unconscious bias, we can return to ourselves and say, okay, I can see myself doing that, but I really value connection, or I really value empathy, or I really value compassion, or I really value business results, or I really value innovation. And we just keep coming back to the things that we value, and that will show us the way forward. And finding and using a community, finding people who are like-minded, people who are interested in talking about unconscious bias, people who can help you to unpick yours, can remind you of your values and what's important to you, can remind you that you don't always see what you think you see. And we can remind them. So having these trusted people at work can support you, because it's not like unconscious. We are constantly in every moment impacted by our unconscious bias. It's not like we can get rid of it or we can fix it. It's about having a light-hearted attitude to, oh, it's just going to happen and I need somebody to point it out. So, you know, the next time when somebody says, oh, I'm going to talk to my assistant, because of that experience, I'm going to think, I'm not necessarily going to jump to a woman. That experience will stay with me, and I'll say, oh, it could be a man here. So in summary, everyone has it. It's the way we're wired, and it's everywhere. Bias impacts the engagement, effectiveness, innovation, risk-taking, decision-making, collaboration, and trust within our workplaces. And there are strategies to recognize and mitigate it. And so I'm going to leave you with some tips about what you can do in your organization. So it's recognizing unconscious bias exists and becoming aware of the different types, especially the cognitive bias. They're less well seen. It's about using the ladder of inference to help you and others see how your biases are leading to your conclusions, and asking questions to yourself and others to challenge your bias. It's about adopting a multiculturalism approach rather than ignoring the differences and pretending that they're not there and saying, oh, I don't see those differences. Everyone's human. We're not. We're all different. So consciously choosing diversity and telling people why, showing atypical examples of success, and promoting work-life balance, like caring for kids, caring for our elderly. Reducing the stress in decision-making, because stress leads to us defaulting into our biases, and eliminating ambiguity. Having blind selection strategies, because we trick ourselves. Our mind plays tricks on us. Even though we think we're being objective, we've got these mind bugs that are working on us at some deep level that we're not even aware of. Providing anonymous employee surveys to identify bias, and not believing everything we think. We can consciously believe in an equality and an inclusive approach while simultaneously acting on unconscious prejudice. So that's me. Over to you. Any questions?
If anyone has any questions, thank you, Liane. That was great. You can use the little question tool in your control panel. And I already have one, Leanne. I can see a lot of
Great.
Unconscious bias at work. How do I open a conversation about it?
Great. And I think that's what everybody, because of the potential for shaming, humiliation, embarrassment, getting it wrong, we often feel hesitant about actually having that conversation. And I think sometimes the way that I do it is just by talking about my own experience, like the way that I started this webinar was to talk about my unconscious bias about the Uber driver. And so somehow it's either sharing your own experience can help, or you can bring it up as a topic, talking about the business outcomes of, hey, did you read the latest research around diverse and inclusive cultures? That can often help. So you're talking about something that is easier to talk about, and it's distant from ourselves. It's inviting people to webinars like these. There's hundreds of TED Talks. Doing implicit bias tests and sharing links with your colleagues can often be interesting, and it's a way for us to see our biases. There are hundreds more, but I'm aware we only have 15 minutes, and so I'm going to move on to some more questions.
How is it, so there's another question. How is it important to trust in the team to really use the ladder of inference and call each other on bias?
So some of the ways that we do it is we separate our opinion from the facts. So it's almost like saying the facts of the situation are, and these are my opinions, or these are my conclusions, or these are my recommendations. So in your emails or in your conversation, breaking down in your own communication the facts from the opinions, from the conclusions, from the recommendations. So once you start as that practice to do that, and it takes a bit of practice, then you can ask the other person, so these are the facts, and you can get agreement. Do you agree these are the facts? These are the opinions I've made, or the interpretations I've made. What are the interpretations that you've made? And you can say, I can see you've come to this conclusion. Can you talk me through it? What are the facts that have gone into that? What are the reasonings? What are the opinions? So you're breaking it out, and you're just helping people to see their thought processes by questioning, what are your opinions? What are your assumptions? What is your conclusion? What were the facts that was based on? So you're helping people to break down their own thinking. That can often show unconscious bias when people go, oh, wow, this happened. And often, we all jump to conclusions, and I think that's pretty well known. And I'm just trying to think, of some of our clients. I was with a client today, and he wanted to do a presentation, and he assumed that the audience, that this was the right topic for the presentation. And I said to him, why have you chosen that topic? What are the facts that you're basing that on? And he went, oh my God, that's such a good question. I hadn't thought about that. Then he went and researched it, and he did a survey to find out what people actually wanted to hear. So he just assumed that they wanted to hear what he thought was a good topic, but he didn't know that until I asked him why he had chosen that, and we were able to break down his thinking, and then he was able to go and collect the facts, and it turns out that the people wanted a different topic. So things like that and he was really grateful, because he would have stood up and talked about something that people weren't that interested in.
Well, you mentioned about using the letter of interest and sharing your thoughts, but how would that work in a team where there might be low trust, or it might always be threatening to reveal your thoughts, or where it's defensive and oppositional?
Great, that's a great question. And also, I'm just smiling at myself about that inference as well, that it's almost like in defensive teams, we have a sort of an unconscious bias, a preference that, we can't talk about this sort of stuff. And actually, for me, having conversations in teams like that is sort of even though it's counterintuitive, it's actually the thing that breaks a team open and builds trust, if we can have the courage to do that, to actually, and I think this goes back to strategy number 2 that I talked about. What's the impact that you want to have? What is it that you want to have in that team, and how do you want that team to be, which goes back to your spiritual harness around what's important. So sometimes, even though it takes a lot of courage to have those conversations, actually the cost of not having those conversations is more tragic, in terms of we are not living up to what we lose our integrity with ourselves. And so actually just having conversations about lack of trust or defensiveness or any of the things that we see going on in a team can be the gateway into shifting the culture in that team. And when teams are quite defensive and there's not much trust, I do recommend that you get a facilitator in to support that process, because it is tough to do it on yourself. But it's almost where those conversations need to happen the most, are in teams where there isn't trust, or they're more defensive. And I suppose, sometimes it's about just asking the same question. So what are the facts? What are the facts? What are the facts? So you're almost like a broken record. And what are the facts we're making this decision on, and why are we doing this? That in those in teams like that, where there is a lack of trust and it's defensive, then there isn't very much collaboration, there isn't very much innovative thought. Problem solving tends to be not very minimal, and we don't think well, we don't think clearly. So actually coming back down and keep saying to people, okay, so what are the facts we're basing this on? What are we? And talking about the facts can actually be a breath of fresh air, because you're actually talking about something that's cognitive and something that's a bit more tangible and grounded in reality. And so people often aren't as emotive. So that actually taking the conversation down. Yeah.
One of the questions is, how do we clearly establish facts?
Good. Very good. Because we have unconscious bias around facts. What are the facts? What are the facts? And I think for me, the facts are the things that we can agree on. Like, it's the lowest common denominator. Like, sometimes they're really obvious, like John's late, it's 9:05 and we agreed to be here for 9. Or we agreed to make a decision in this meeting and we haven't made it yet. Sometimes the facts are very obvious, but in most cases they're not. Most cases they're complex and complicated. And so for me, the facts are also usually what we commonly agree with. So if we have a meeting and we say, okay, at the end of this meeting, the outcome of this meeting is we need to make a decision about how to go forward with this project. Does everybody agree? So then there's an agreement that we make a decision by the end of the meeting. And then that becomes a fact. We agreed that we would make a decision. And then we can then you can say, so what happened? Why didn't we make a decision? We agreed it. It's a fact. What are our opinions about why we didn't make a decision? What are our conclusions, our recommendations? So the facts for me are usually the things that people agree on, or the things that can be measured, or the things that are specific, or the things that are objective. And it is difficult to find them sometimes.
Great, thank you, Leanne. I have another question. Lots of managers want to work with equals of themselves. How can unconscious bias help to generate diversity of thought?
Say that again. If managers want to...
A lot of managers would want to work with equals of themselves. How can unconscious bias help to generate diversity of thought?
Yes, we do tend to choose people who are the same as us, often unconsciously, until somebody challenges us on that. I've created lots of teams over my life, and I always like to choose somebody that's going to challenge me on my decisions about who I choose to be in my team, because I will automatically choose somebody that's the same as me. So how can we develop diversity of thought in those teams? I think what comes to mind is an activity that we used to do with a company where everybody put on different hats, and in those hats you had to look for a certain so one person was holding the facts, one person was holding wacky ideas. So you give people roles that they can. So your role is to be the devil's advocate, or your role is to think of wacky ideas, or your role is to always ask questions. So if you have a homogeneous team, actually giving people roles to take on so that you can invite diversity of thought. So you're not thinking as you, but you're thinking as the role or as a person. Like if Nelson Mandela was here, what do you think he would say? Or if Mother Teresa was here, what do you think she would say? So you're encouraging diversity of thought by asking people to step into other people's shoes.
Thank you. I think this is the last question. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. No, I could go on. I'm just pausing because otherwise I know I won't get through all the questions.
What is a cognitive bias versus other bias? And do you have any examples?
What's a cognitive bias versus other biases? Was that
Yes.
Barbie?
Yep, that was the question.
Great. So you know, there's gender bias, there's race bias, there's class bias, age bias, cognitive bias, and a cognitive bias are the ones that I think I showed you earlier. So here I'm just looking back through my computer to show you some of the biases. These are the more cognitive biases. So they're biases in our thinking processes. And so we don't think clearly and rationally. Our thinking is prejudice, or we have a preference in the way that we think. Like the recency effect is the tendency to weigh the latest information more heavily than older data. And then there's the primacy effect where you weight the first information that you see. So in interviews, commonly people will remember the first person that they interviewed or the last person that they'll interview. They're either impacted by the primacy effect or the recency effect. So we have biases in the way that we remember, the way that we make decisions, the way that we problem solve, the way that we make judgments. All of those are cognitive biases.
Thank you, Leanne. So there's no other questions. So I think we can close the session here. We hope you enjoyed today's session, and we look forward to seeing you on one of our next webinars. So have a good evening.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Barbie.